Hey, 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 hey. It's Hockey Jersey Thursday. It's one of the best 5 days of the regular work week. And you know what's good about this week? There's no classes tomorrow. It's just today. Today is like Friday without the Friday song. But it's Thursday, Hockey Jersey Thursday. And we're talking about Darwin. And today we're talking about natural selection. Yes, the answer to what he called the mystery of mysteries. Natural selection. Let's dive into that, shall we?
All right.
Hey now.
Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
It's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
When on board the HMS Beagle as a naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts on the distribution of the organic beings inhabiting South America. These facts, as we'll see in the later chapters of this volume, seem to throw some light on that mystery of mysteries, the origin of species. Where do no forms come from? That was this book. This book, which is still in print, written in 18, you can see it's all dog-eared and noted up because it really is probably the most important book ever written in terms of understanding of life on Earth and how life works. Is it a great read? I'm going to say no. It's kind of boring. Was written in Victorian times, and so the standards of English were different in terms of what made for good reading. The language is very flowery, and and you know, Darwin was a good writer. He wrote kind of an essay style, and his chapters would be like what you would call body paragraphs in your essays, but they would be repetitive. So he would give here's an example, and then here's another example, and here's another example of the same thing, and then here's another example of the same thing, and then another example, and another one, and another one, and another one. He went on and on and on and on and on. I mean, paperback version is 460 pages, right? But it's good to know what he wrote. And so I'm going to give you kind of synopsis of what he came up with in this book today, kind of the what do you really need to know about Darwin's Origin of Species. First thing you need to know about Origin of Species is that he wrote in 1859, some 20 years after the voyage of the Beagle. And he even writes in the book, he wasn't quite finished with all his research yet, but he felt pressure to write the book because he had a colleague, a man named Wallace, who was coming up with basically the same idea. So Darwin wanted to beat him to the punch, and he admits that in the book. Okay. Anyway, Darwin says that this book is about where new species come from, right? And he came up with this idea that, and it was based on the fact that you have similar looking, all these similarities that we've looked at, like embryos and things like that. He said that that's because of what's called descent with modification. That is, generations tend to look like their parents, but not every offspring looks exactly like their parents. And so some offspring look different, some offspring look even more different, some look more different. Sometimes those differences have an advantage, sometimes they have a disadvantage. And that will affect whether or not you yourself have children and so forth. So we call that natural selection, is that there's variation among offspring, and not all the offspring make it. In fact, he called it the war of nature. And he said that most species overproduce. That is, they make more offspring than could possibly survive, it's like they know that most of them are going to die and never get a chance to reproduce themselves. But some will make it. And the ones that make it are the ones that are going to reproduce and pass on their likeness to the next generation, right? And as long as conditions are good, this likenesses will pass on and on and on. What he said, that if conditions change, then some likenesses are going to pass on easier than others. And if conditions change big enough, and if you give it enough time, you can take one group of organisms and split them into two separate species. At least that's what he called natural selection. His best explanation was what he called geographic isolation, where things happen, right? So you have a species, a group of organisms, and then something splits the population into two groups. Something massive, like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a flood or something like that. And then the organisms on either side of this disruption have different selective pressures. That is, maybe there's different predators on one side, or there's a different type of forest on the other side, right? And so who lives and who dies becomes different. And he said that if that happens, the two groups can change into two groups that are now species or are distinct from one another. One thing he never said is you're never going to get a big change. He never said that you get a big jump from, he wouldn't say you went from fish to humans. He said it would have to be small incremental steps over eons. One of the problems Darwin had was he wasn't quite sure how much time was available in terms of the history of the Earth, right? His best bet was that it was a few 100,000 years, maybe a few million years, 100 million years. But we know now that there have been billions of years. There's enough time for this stuff to happen. And then what we've also learned since Darwin is that big of jumps in species making and that kind of thing don't have to be slow. They can occur quickly. And we'll talk about that at a later date, some examples. All right. Great irony now is that Darwin's finches, the finches on the Galapagos, are often used to show us how evolution from common ancestors descent with modification has happened, right? The different beaks being basically different tools to open different seeds, and on certain islands, you had one kind of seeds that favored one beak, and on the other island, you had different types of food which favored a different beak. The great irony is Darwin didn't pay any attention to finches. He collected some, we know, but most of the work has been done in the last 50 years or so, the work of two scientists from Princeton University who have studied the finches on the Galapagos. And our next lab, well, at least one of our next labs coming up, is we're going to redo one of the Grant's famous experiments with the beaks of the finches. All right? So it's just irony. You'll see people associate finches with Darwin. Darwin really didn't care that much about the finches. He was more interested in tortoises and iguanas and things like that. So yeah, I gave you kind of the nutshell version of Origin of Species. I mean, it's in the library. You can check it out if you want. There's a lot of interesting details and things in here, and not a single thing about genes. Darwin didn't know anything about genes. He knew that things were inherited, right? He knew that parents looked like their offspring, but he didn't know anything about genes. And yeah, he still was able to figure this out. All right, happy Hockey Jersey Thursday.